Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. So, welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Deepen, and I'm pastor of the Village Church in Tucson. And across from me is Andy Littleton, pastor of Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona. We've been doing this podcast for a while. And we jumped out of Fallow Month. Eric jumped out of Fallow Month to answer a question from our listener in North Carolina.
Yep.
And I just want to say, if you want a book from our bookshelf, send us a question. We'll send you a book from the bookshelf that we're no longer reading.
Right.
And if you give us a little bit, like kind of your likes or dislikes when it comes to books, we'll try to fit in to that category and give us your address so we can send it. You got to be in the, the 48 states.
That's right.
We are not mailing to Canada or Europe.
So yes, right. Our topic, or we will if you send us an extra
money.
$40 or something.
There is a tip place on all of our podcasts.
Oh, really?
Locations. So if you want to tip us, you can do that.
I didn't even know that.
Just monetize this week.
Whoa. Our topic today, by the way, has to do with Protestant Christians and Catholics and relationships. In which, if you're in a relationship, whether dating or friends, and kind of how to think about that, how to understand that, what exactly you're inviting each other into, and the gospel as it relates to all that. So that's a topic that we didn't have on our radar, but it's a great one.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, listener, and enjoy.
Yeah.
And send us your question.
Yeah, I got one thing because it's the end of the year.
Oh, shoot.
For the intro, as it goes in, it's just a couple things. If you like Faith Over Breakfast, then there's a couple other podcasts you can listen to. Andy's church has a podcast called Odd Church, which is a really good podcast to listen to. The Village has one called Healing the City.
Yeah,
you can listen to that. And if you're a sports fan, The Village started a podcast called Dudes, Foods, and Sports, and it's hosted by an 11-year-old kid at the Village, so he would love it if you listened to him and gave him a shout out. So there we go.
That's awesome.
All right, enjoy the podcast. Check.
Checkity check. Eric, good morning.
Good morning.
To see you. So I need to point out to the listening world here really quick that Eric is amidst something that they at the Village call Fallow Month. And what that means is that they say no to virtually everything in order to let the ground go fallow, if you will. And so for the month of December, when we all get very busy, their church has decided to do as little as possible. They keep everything simple. They don't. There's the studies stop, right? The
Bible
the band is simple,
yes.
Everything like that. And one such thing that gets kiboshed is this podcast with me. Except Eric has emerged from the fallow earth in which he was peacefully lying in rest because he wants to talk about this. And so that means this is good. This is a good one. I just want you all to know how big of a deal. I feel honored.
Sometimes I don't know if you're trying to make fun of me or something, Andy.
I am absolutely making fun of you a little bit.
Okay, just check.
But also, I legitimately know that you're excited to talk about this, and I do feel honored to be with you. I wanted to give a little context to the weightiness.
It is
what's
weighty.
Happening. And by the way, I and so many are so jealous of your December Fallow Month. It really is a great idea.
And I think people kind of are like, oh, you do nothing. I actually do a lot more.
Yes. I absolutely know that there's no way that you just, lay around on the couch.
Right.
It's instead of going 200 miles an hour.
Well, I think when just the cool thing about Fallow Month for me is there are fields within the church that have been fallow for 11 months.
Yeah.
And must be worked, right? While the one that has been worked continuously lays fallow. So,
Okay.
There's a lot of, as a pastor of a small church, this, there's no matter how many administrators and people and volunteers you have, there is an administrative cloud that sits way in the back of all things that aren't necessary but are necessary.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it rears its ugly head during the year, and then it goes back. And so some of Fallow Month is just leisurely taking care of those things without having to think, I need to go to this meeting. Oh, this meeting can't run over into this. It's just like, we're going to do this, and we can do this all day because we don't have anything else to do. Sort of just lean into this and enjoy it.
The imagery that just came into my mind when you were talking about that administrative cloud, and this probably isn't accurate, but I thought of the nothing in the never-ending story, which, by the way, is that when I watched that as an adult, I remain a little creeped out. There's some truth in that whole the nothing. Oh, anyway, but that was when that shows you my view on administration. I view administration as a dark, evil, looming cloud. Yeah.
That's why we have to hire wizards. We call them admin assistants.
That's right. That's what it is. Okay.
Anyway, so what got me out of Fallow Month was we had a listener who asked us a question, and I didn't want her to wait.
Yeah. And I think you're excited about the question and excited that it's a listener from North Carolina we don't know.
Right.
And so that's fun. So
I used to live in North Carolina.
Whoa. I have once been to North Carolina.
So we have a link to North Carolina.
Wow.
My first basketball team was not the U of A. That's not who I root for, but it was Duke.
Ooh.
Because in North Carolina,
not a Tar Heel, A Dukester.
No. Well, in North Carolina, when the NCAA tournament comes around, all the schools shut down. I mean, you still go to school, but there's a TV in every single, at least when I was there in 7th, 8th grade, there's a TV in every class.
Wow.
And I remember a kid looking at me and saying, "Who are you rooting for?"
Yeah.
And he said, and I said, "I don't know I don't know. I'd never heard of this tournament thing." And he said, "Well, you can root for Duke, NC State, Wake Forest, or North Carolina. That's your only 4 choices."
Wow.
And guess what? All of them were in the tournament.
Yeah.
So
here's another Duke thing, or Duke moment. So I have participated, I believe, once in a full-on bracket, for the NCAA tournament. And by full-on, I mean maybe I put one in but didn't put any money in or something. But one time I did put in money. And wait,
you're making a gambling confession on air.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you it was at a church as well. Okay.
Oh, no.
And the senior pastor was a huge Tar Heel fan, and so I know about basketball. I'm generally with sports.
You're a decent basketball player.
Thank you.
Good shot.
You're not bad yourself. You got some moves in the paint.
A little bit of a jump.
I can. A little bit of a jump.
Right, it's about 2 inches, but it's a good shot.
I have a very mediocre vertical leap, but I can shoot.
You can shoot. You're a very good shooter.
Really practiced, that'd be fun. Thank you. Anyway, so I know how to play the game of basketball, but I don't tend to follow. So, it's tournament time. I don't know. I have no idea. So I took my bracket, and there were 2 things I knew I was going to do. I was just going to pick the team whose name I liked better in every contest, and I was going to have our senior pastor's least favorite team win the whole thing. So Duke was my, and I picked, I was like Gonzaga. Oh yeah, John Stockton came from there. That's a cool name.
Right,
they're gonna win. And I just did that, and I took the pot. I won the whole. I won the whole thing at one time,
crazy.
And I've kind of bowed out ever since. I was like, I took it. I'm done. Never doing that again.
You are a bracket winner, and you're going home.
I'm done. Yeah, I retired.
Well, we should get down to business.
We are getting down to business. So here's the gist of the question. We just read over it before we got on. And I should say, this is the true faith over breakfast, because Eric ate breakfast even like right before we tuned in. And I was just before, and we both have our coffees. It feels so good.
It does. It feels
right.
Authentic.
So our question has to do with Protestants and Catholics, and especially in relationships, especially in the younger generations. And our listener was asking this because they're in a relationship that crosses over, where she's a Protestant, her boyfriend is a Catholic, and the and just how to engage that. How important is it? Should a Protestant visit a Catholic church? And I guess I should just really quickly say her language wasn't so much Protestant, but that's more of the Protestant church.
She used gospel a lot.
Yeah, yes, which is a great word. The reason I'm using Protestant is because at one point, most of us our lineage probably goes back to some form of the Catholic or Orthodox Church, and then there was a break-off in the Protestant Reformation from that for some good reasons, and then there was an eventual splintering of that break-off into thousands of denominations, and so, but the general term people give to that group is Protestant. Protesters. They protested.
They did.
So there's a rift. There's a long-standing rift between the two, though it's changed a little.
It has changed a little.
Yep.
And I think the first part of the question is just sort of Catholics' understanding of their own faith.
Mm-hmm.
And
then what do you do in a relationship?
And the observation was that there is a trend for them not knowing a lot about what they believe or not really practicing their Catholicism. And I would say certainly that has been my experience, because Catholicism is both cultural and a faith for people. My dad grew up in the Catholic Church, and so I have a little bit of experience of that. And my dad has a lot of respect for that community and also feels very Catholic, even though he is a Protestant. He really identifies with that. And I think there's been a resurgence of what I would say a more gospel-oriented way of following Jesus with like people like Bishop Barron.
Right.
And I think the number one podcast in religious sense is, in the religious category, is a Catholic priest who reads the Bible.
Yes.
I can't remember his name. I was going to look that up, but I didn't have a chance to.
There's definitely...
So there is a resurgence in faith, I think, within young Catholics.
And not only that, there are a group of more Protestant or evangelical folks who are moving into Catholicism from Christianity currently. So Mark Galli, the former, the editor of Christianity Today, he wrote a piece kind of denouncing Donald Trump, left Christianity Today, and then I don't know that people knew this was about to happen, but he converted to Catholicism immediately after. And so that there are things of that nature, and there are a lot of younger folks I know, not necessarily going to Catholicism, but moving into more ancient forms.
Right. There is a movement there.
And it's interesting because I have observed, so because of my store and furniture company and such, I get a lot of architecture stuff crossing my news feeds.
Mm-hmm.
And the current big discussion in interior design is the grand millennial aesthetic. Okay, here's what it is. The grand millennial aesthetic is essentially millennials with money are looking to fill their lives with kind of things that help them reminisce, feel connected to the past, and feel a sense of luxury or peace. And it was interesting, as I was reading this article, I thought, that's exactly the same as what I'm seeing happen in the church. I'm not criticizing it. There's some really good sides of that. People, they were saying about the grand millennial, why are they looking for they want their grandmother's chair back. They want to find the chair their grandmother had or whatever. And it's because they want to feel a connection to something in the past that felt stable.
Right, because there's not a lot of stability.
There's not a lot of stability, and felt comfortable, even practically, but then emotionally comfortable. And so I think a lot of people who grew up in things like Catholicism, there's a group, I think, who've rejected it outright, who never want to touch it again, who are in the evangelical world. There's a group who grew up in it, kind of left it, and now are reminiscing about it. And then there's the folks that have never left, and there are varying relationships to it within that groups.
Right, and I think there is a large group of, it's almost connected to, like, I'm Jewish, but I don't practice any kind of Jewish. I'm not Orthodox. I'm not conservative. I'm just Jewish. Some people call them secular Jews, but I would just say it's a cultural identifier. So to be Catholic has a lot of cultural connections. So you're gonna go to Mass once a year or twice a year. You're gonna you kind of participate in some of the extra festivals that are kind of surrounding things that are important to you, but you don't have a personal, what we would call in a Protestant world, there's not a personal relationship with Jesus. There's not an interaction that has depth that you're nurturing.
Right. And I want to maybe just press on that slightly. I essentially agree with you. But at the same time, there is something to the power of kind of habit and tradition that a lot of Protestants have lost.
Yes, sure, definitely.
And even so, those simple, like, we always go to church with our family on Easter.
Right.
And that there's a certain celebration we always do. Those are very formative practices for faith.
Yes.
That Protestants have underestimated, myself included, and that Catholics have held to well. And so when you suggest that you have to leave that, that's all of a sudden it's like those are my anchoring moments in my life, and they have formed faith. And so that's, I think, a dilemma for some who say there's someone in the Catholic Church who says, I want to have the little more vibrant personal thing that my Protestant friend says they have, or that I see in them. But I don't want to leave this. So is that okay? Again, that's part of maybe the question that our listeners ask.
Well, I think it's okay. I think if you have like the person who emailed us, if you've got a lot of Catholic friends and they're willing to engage in things, then you should engage in a sense of bring what you have. Because I think part of the beauty of Christianity is that God is okay with our strange fracturedness. Yeah. And when we can engage him in that without like trying to persuade about like what is wrong.
Right.
So, but to really, one of the things that we have as, people who, we tend to be people who read our Bibles. That's what Protestants are in a lot of ways, in the kind of in study. We're students of the Bible.
Yeah.
So that's a gift we've been given.
And we tend to read it very individually.
Sure.
Whereas the Catholic Church has believed more in a corporate reading.
Right. And when we believe in the individual interpreting.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think one of the ways is, particularly, listener, as you kind of walk with your boyfriend, is inviting him to read the scripture, being willing to go to Catholic Church with him, and actually encouraging a more robust attendance of his church.
Right.
And if he doesn't have a particular parish, doing a little research and finding a parish that has a more evangelistic style, in the sense of that they have groups and things that are helping develop their parishioners, then go to that one and get involved. I would say, if you really love him and he's willing to anchor into Jesus and in the Catholic Church, dive into the Catholic Church and bring your faith, to bear there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was kind of what I heard from the email was that our listener has more of the home church is already connected. And I was actually going to suggest, I think going over with him on the days that are important to him would be, I think that'd be a good idea. I think meeting him there, hearing what he's heard, finding discussion points, and I'm gonna assume or guess that there's kind of a home parish that is maybe his already, and so that enter into there. It's not. I would say there are fundamental disagreements that I would have with some of the things that might be taught in a Catholic church. I went to a funeral with somebody from our church whose family is Catholic, and the purgatory discussion was actually really thick in the funeral, and this idea that like their sins they were going to begin working off their sins now, and this is something that as somebody who didn't grow up in the Catholic Church, I'd heard of this but hadn't really heard it taught, and here it was being very specifically taught within this service, and so I'm not going to agree with that wholesale. I think there's some interesting reasons why the doctrine exists. But at the same time, I don't think it's the same as kind of going into a cult or something like that. Like my point is, I think you could go hear that, have a discussion about that. It's not as dangerous as maybe some other faiths that people are worried about going and becoming a part of, where you kind of get sucked in or where there's manipulation or something like that. I don't think that's what's happening there.
Well, and I think partly the problem with us good Protestants analyzing Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church is a lot like the Protestant Church, that you can go from city to city, parish to parish.
Many different, especially since Vatican II. Right?
Yeah, you're going to get different theology. You're going to get different understandings of Scripture. You're going to get different understandings of discipleship within that.
Yeah.
And depending on the culture. And so I think you can find Catholic churches that will line up a little bit more with the gospel.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, I mean, there's a reason people are converting to Catholicism out of Protestant faith, because there's some substance there that they feel is missing.
Yeah. I just read a book a little bit ago. I think it was called Another Kind of Cell, and it was about, I believe he was a Jesuit, but it was a priest who was ministering to somebody who was one of the most notorious murderers in the prison system. And interestingly, it comes up in the book that this priest had formerly been Protestant.
Right.
And he actually talked about how his Catholicism was far more infused with the reading of the word and with like proclamation of the specifics of the gospel because of his Protestantism. So kind of that the blend was had really enriched his tradition. And so you're right, there's room within the Catholic Church, as there is in the Protestant Church, for all kinds of versions of this. And same is true, like say for our listener, say you were to say, I'd like us to go to church together, and you're looking at your options. Well, maybe a more ancient form of Christianity would be a better hybrid, would be a better space for the two of you. Because
Right.
like straight up, not sure what like your non-denominational church looks like, but that might be a lurch.
Right.
That might be a lot. And so if you were to engage in something like, find just a more liturgical church, there's a lot of types, but something that felt
Yes.
a little more like a hybrid, maybe that would be a good
Right.
place for both of you.
Right. If you end up the Anglican Church, we have at the Village a lot of kids who grew up Catholic, and the Village feels very Catholic to them because of the candles and because they recite the creed, and that's familiar to them. There's a bit of standing up and sitting down that's involved that you're invited to do. So though it's far from the Catholic Church, it has these pieces that people are like, that feels familiar to me.
I just had dinner with a new attendee to our church who is coming from non-denominational and Baptist backgrounds, and though our church, in my mind, doesn't feel that liturgical, he was very like what was with that like doxology thing? He was kind of.
You have a very liturgical church.
We do actually,
yes.
and he, in his view, could sense it. And we've heard from people with Catholic backgrounds, especially in the Hispanic community here in Tucson. Some have either thought it's too Catholic if they're like trying to distance themselves, or on the flip side, it's nice. It's a nice kind of combination we've heard. So that could be something to consider.
Yeah. So I would just go back to our listener really quick and maybe not answer the Catholic Protestant question, but actually just ask. Because she mentioned getting married,
right?
And one of the things I would suggest before you get married is that you have a lot of conversations about this, because you don't want to get married and then have children and be in a place where you're trying to figure this out. In some ways, you want to kind of be unified on the way you're going to practice faith together before you're married.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of clarity in the conversation. Like your husband or your boyfriend knows exactly where you're coming from, and you know where he's coming from, and you guys have thoughts on what the future would look like for maturity and faith for both of you. Like that conversation. And if you have to initiate that conversation, I would initiate it.
Sure.
So you don't wait around for it to be initiated.
Absolutely. I have two sets of friends I wanted tell little bits of
and
story.
I have
and
one, so
you,
we'll go from there.
yeah, on this very topic. So one, one coming from a Catholic background, one coming from a more Protestant background. I believe there were discussions, but at the way it's worked out so far is that one of them still isn't really engaging in the church much, and that's probably a holdover from being used to their experience of Catholicism, which was you went a couple times a year. And I think this idea of like weekly plus a Bible study is just still very foreign and feels like a lot. And so one of them is engaging more than the other, even though they did discuss it. So I think there's a place for discussing. And as with these friends, my suggestion there is patience, because it's a big change. It's a big move. So encouragement, sharing the hope that you would like them to be worshiping with you. This is a big part of life. And then there is still a space for some patience in that. I personally agree with you. You should talk about it, but I wouldn't say it's like utter deal breaker if they're not 100% where you are yet. If you deeply love one another, are committed to each other, and are committed to Jesus. But it'd be ideal if you worshiped, studied, shared all of that part of your life together. That would be preferred. The other story I have was my best friend growing up, who he very much grew up in not only Protestant, but kind of more Wesleyan versions of that, where there's a lot of you're in church a lot. It's very individual, very personal,
right?
And ends up a girl from his school who was a runner. Jogged over to his house with some ice cream after he got his wisdom teeth pulled, and he was like, "Who are you? What is this?" He'd met her, but he was like, "Whoa, she's really pretty," and she was Catholic. So they got to know each other because of this act of generosity and kindness, and began dating, and they hadn't really had the discussion, honestly. They kind of just got to know each other. Well, he was just really involved in church, and she just wanted to be with him. She just said, "Wherever you're going, I'll go." It was kind of very Ruth and Naomi feeling, like she's just like, I'll go with you. And in a couple of years, without any formal conversion, if you will, she was the far more passionate, like, church attendee. She'd never gone through any kind of renouncing Catholicism or anything. She just really latched into it. I think she made friends. She just wanted to be there with him. So I've seen different versions of it. I think it does kind of depend on the person. For her, her Catholicism she was God haunted, if you will. Like the furniture was there, meaning the basic assumptions that there's a creator and that creator died to redeem humanity. That was she had that built in, and it was easier for her to fully engage in church in a way.
Yeah.
And she did. And she just really, and I remember him calling me one time and saying, "Dude, she's a better Christian than me. How did I do this?" And we kind of laughed, because truth was he didn't really do anything, right? That's just what happened. So there's a couple stories just to illustrate it's different every time.
Yeah, I mean, we had a man in our church and his wife. They started pretty close to the beginning of the village. His wife was Catholic, so she never came, and he was really involved.
Yeah,
and she would go to Catholic church sometimes.
Yeah,
and she would come to our church on Easter, and Christmas, our Christmas service, and that was it. Yeah. And then I think 10 years in, she just started coming.
Yep.
And she started being part of the church, and she stopped going to Mass, and the village was her church.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a conversion. She was already a follower of Jesus.
Right.
But it was just, she grew up Catholic, that's how she did it. And
she kind of learned a new way of following Jesus over time with you all. Yeah.
And then they retired, and they just moved last year to, I think, Kentucky.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's...
Yeah.
These things happen and they can work out. I really think that the important part is the kind of conversation about God, about Jesus that you're having together, and the kind of spirituality you're nurturing together.
Yeah.
Because certainly you can go to a Catholic church and you may have to sort out some of the teachings and be like, okay, or you can go to a Protestant church and he'll have to sort out some of the culture for himself. But the reality is more important, your relationship. Like, how are you guys centering yourself under Christ? And can you do that together regardless of what kind of background? And can he step into more maturity? And can you offer that with some vulnerability?
And let's speak to the gospel piece.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because I think a concern for our listener is the centrality of the gospel in all of this. And so there can be an assumption, and I do think that that in more Protestant churches there is a lot of good emphasis on some very key points of the gospel. In most Protestant churches, you're going to hear about the death and resurrection. You're going to hear about how that applies to you personally and how you should accept that. Right? Those are key things. I think they're important things. And then there can be an assumption that in the Catholic Church, the gospel isn't as important. And I would say in some circles of it, it is diminished in many ways. But I might counter to that sometimes the Catholics have some things about the gospel a little more down pat than many Protestants.
Yes.
So anyway, I know you have thoughts on this. Anyway, do you want to pitch in a little on in what ways do you see, Catholics actually understanding some elements of the gospel?
Well, I think you're going to get, in what a lot of us long for in the Protestant church that we don't have, is you're going to get some really rich church history.
Yes.
Because as a follower of Jesus who is part of the Christian Reformed Church, there's some history of the Christian Reformed Church that I can hold on to. But it's pretty young in comparison. And I if I'm going to claim the church fathers, if I'm going to think through the early church, I'm thinking through the Catholic Church.
Right.
I'm thinking through a unified community, even though it may not have been unified. Obviously it wasn't, but that's where I'm linking in, and there's an ancientness to it. And so I think that's beautiful. I think sometimes when we understand Scripture in the Protestant church, we write off church history a little bit too much.
Yes.
And we say that the church fathers don't really have as much to say about the Scripture because they didn't really get it.
Right.
Yeah, but we do now, apparently. Right. So I think there's a little bit of that, like contempt, that is then kind of dries out your faith in a way, or it doesn't give it the richness or fullness that you would hope for. I also think just the splendor of having a service always built around the death of Christ.
Right.
You don't get that, the death and resurrection of Christ. You don't get that built into your service a lot of times at a Protestant church.
When I said that about the Protestant church, what I meant is you might hear the words spoken very clearly, but the interesting thing in the Catholic Church and in some more ancient forms of church, it doesn't always need to be preached in the sermon because it's enacted in the liturgy every single service.
Right.
And so there's actually this, and if James K.A. Smith is right in the book, You Are What You Love, that actually our patterns of living are more formative than just the views we adopt.
Yes.
Then actually in a sense, some of those ancient forms of church, including the Catholic Church, might be embedding some of those beliefs deeper than Protestant churches. I think, to come back to what you were saying about the ancientness, I think that another element of the gospel that some of these ancient churches get right is that the gospel, defining gospel as God's good news, and that absolutely includes the life, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus, return of Jesus. But it also includes the fact that there is a people of God that God has made promises to, and that he has been faithful to despite their sin, and that it's all of grace, and that this spans the entire history that the Bible is working out for us and teaching us and reminding us about, and the entire history of the church. And the Catholic Church does a good job, as do other ancient forms, of preaching the gospel as it applies to the whole church.
Yes.
Not just you and me in our particular moment in particular headspace.
Right.
And that actually makes the gospel really big, and it actually confronts us in many ways, because the gospel is good news for the entire world.
Right.
It's good news for creation, that there is a plan, and that it is good, and that things will be redeemed and restored. And so the gospel all these things about Jesus are integral to it.
Right.
But that's also not all there is to it.
Right.
And so, anyway, I would just say a lot of Protestant churches actually reduce the gospel down to just being a decision between me and Jesus.
Yes.
And that's a loss to the gospel. And so then when maybe in the Catholic Church, the idea of a saint goes a little too far, that's a reduction too, I would say. Like the representation of another person
Right.
on our behalf, but it's not a sin unique to the Catholic Church.
Right.
Every form of church has diminished the gospel.
Right.
I don't know of one that's nailed it. Yeah.
Right. No, I think that's good, and I hope it's helpful. I mean, the thing that I would want to take away or to offer is it really does come down to you and your friends. It comes down to you and your boyfriend, and not necessarily an intellectual analysis of Catholicism or your own faith, as much as how do I engage relationally around the truth of Jesus and his impact and transformation of me and of those around me. How do I invite people into that?
Yes.
And that's actually a little bit more scary than which church should I go to, or how do I get someone to believe the right things, of just like, let's engage Jesus together and be willing to invite people into that. Yeah. Which is, not maybe everybody, maybe your boyfriend, maybe your friends don't want to do that, but it's something to invite people into.
Absolutely. And on that note, and just expanding that same idea, I think that picking a church is often viewed as the ticket. If we get into the right church, that will accomplish X, Y, or Z. Truth be told, and we know this as pastors, the far more important thing is that you are bringing the kingdom, you are bringing the gospel into these people's lives. And church is a place where believers are formed and where they gather together so that they can do mission six days a week, essentially, or the rest of their lives. And so the power of the gospel, the bringing of the kingdom, you actually are far more equipped to do it in a way than a church, in the lives of people you know and love dearly. And so what church background they're coming from is kind of little consequence. And getting them in the right church is not the ticket. It's you have the Holy Spirit, and you know them and love them, and you can speak kind of Jesus's words and kingdom into their life way better than any pastor could. You know them. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So
yeah. I think that's an answer. I don't know if it's the best answer in the world, but there you are. There's the answer to our podcast listener.
Yeah,
and North Carolina.
And hey, thanks for reaching out. It was an awesome question.
I mean, it really was. We would never talk about. I mean, we probably wouldn't talk about it without that question.
We probably wouldn't have. And then obviously, we have people in our churches, as we're mentioning, that have been on this journey and still are. And it was helpful to get the question because it'll speak to others too. Yeah, so thank you for that. And feel free to send any more you have, and others out there, as we always say, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. Send us your questions, and we will get to them. We might even get to them faster than we'd get to anything else, it turns out.
We like your questions a lot. It helps us, after doing this for 3 years, to have things to talk about that are new and fresh.
And we'll send you a book from our library. So Eric is sending the book this time. I see books on the table. They're looking good. And so... enjoy the books. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.